Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is a surprisingly decent sprite-based beat-em-up based on the graphic novel and film of the same name. Unfortunately, due to some licensing conflicts, it was pulled from digital stores back in 2014, making it completely inaccessible to anyone who didn't already own it. Or rather, I would be saying that if not for an announcement ushering in its return at long last for modern platforms. Funnily enough, it was this surprise reveal that reminded me that while I played the game a bit when it initially came out, and even saw the movie, I had never gotten around to reading the graphic novel these adaptations were based on. Emboldened by its recent surge of relevance, I aim to rectify this gap in my knowledge by reading all 6 volumes and rewatching the film for good measure. Although due to my crippling addiction to Final Fantasy XIV, I didn't end up playing the game when it finally resurfaced. Go figure. The end result was a fantastic journey that shockingly left a bittersweet void at the center of my being. One that necessitates this very video in order to work out how I feel about it. While I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Scott Pilgrim and would love to dive deeper into its subtext, more than anything, this video will be a personal journey in order to confront my old demons. Before getting into that though, for those that ignored the spoiler warning and have never read the graphic novel or even watched the film, let's do a quick rundown of the story. The plot itself isn't anything too complicated. Scott Pilgrim is just a normal Canadian dude, but suddenly he meets Ramona Flowers, the girl of his dreams, and I mean that both figuratively and literally, since she utilizes a form of travel known as subspace in order to quickly traverse long distances, which somehow results in her skating through a couple of his bedtime visions. The two eventually meet and even start dating. However, it turns out that she has 7 evil ex-boyfriends that he needs to defeat in order to be with her, and that's pretty much exactly what he does. Beyond the literal plot synopsis, the meat of the experience comes from the genuinely good humor, the plethora of wonderful character moments, the dynamic relationships that ebb and flow all throughout, and the emotional ups and downs that come from all of this and more. To put it simply, it's the finer details culminating in a way that brings to life the straightforward plot and becomes so much more than the sum of its parts. So, okay, this is all well and good, but Scott Pilgrim was so much more than just an entertaining romp. It was something that spoke to me in a profound way. Given the colorful art and focus on humor, the idea that it affected me in such a deep manner might seem ridiculous on the face of it. How could this goofy comic book about a dingus fighting some overpowered dickheads possibly resonate so strongly? Well, for starters, despite appearances, there's so much more going on with the narrative than what lies on the surface, as the characters' story beats are used as a vehicle to get across messages about relationships and personal growth. But for me, that's only half the story. As reticent as I am to admit it, the way I feel has everything to do with the uncomfortable connection established between myself and the titular character. Scott and I have more in common than I'd care to admit. Yet on the same token, it's also like we're worlds apart. He's a bitter reflection that's paradoxically at arm's length. Personality-wise, I'm not the extroverted goofball he's often portrayed as I tend to be subdued and keep to myself in most cases. Yet I can be just as silly and outspoken when amongst close friends or discussing something I'm passionate about. Scott has a habit of acting in self-interest, which tends to inadvertently hurt those close to him. And while I'm comparatively far more mindful of others, I imagine like a lot of people, I do have my regretfully self-centered moments. Above all else though, the direct comparison that gets me on a deep, visceral level are his actions, how he justifies his behavior to himself, and how he reflects on them. Or more accurately, how he doesn't. Throughout the books, there's an emerging issue regarding Scott's questionable memory retention. These aren't just random brain farts where he neglects to do the dishes. Instead, these are significant gaps in his recollection of events that more often than not relate specifically to his ex-girlfriends, Envy Adams in particular, but let's put a bookmark on her for the moment. Initially, the portrayal of this hazy memory can come across as a joke. in a sort of, oh, that's Scott, what a forgetful goof. This implementation is so subtle, in fact, that for most of the books it comes across as a character quirk more than anything else. In a way, it's actually quite sinister how his forgetfulness can be hand-waved in this fashion, and the insidious nature of these lapses in memory become alarmingly apparent in Volume 6. Before jumping that far ahead, however, we need to start with Volume 2 and talk about Scott's ex-girlfriend and current drummer for his band, Kim Pine, who also happens to be my favorite character. Volume 2 contains an extended flashback sequence that reveals how Scott and Kim met in high school and then started dating. Seemingly out of nowhere, she's kidnapped by the evil Simon Lee, whom Scott defeated in order to save her, sparking their mutual attraction for each other. Everything seemed to be going great as they held hands, played together in their band, and enjoyed their young love. But the romance was cut short when Scott revealed to Kim that he was moving away to Toronto. Normally, this would simply be a bittersweet exploration of these characters' backstories in order to contextualize Kim's pointed behavior towards Scott throughout the main story. And that's exactly how it comes across to the reader until Volume 6. In what has to be one of the most important and defining moments in the entire narrative, we come to find out that this early interpretation was nearly a complete fabrication by Scott, revealing him to have been an unreliable narrator this entire time. While Scott's recollection of his time with Kim was portrayed as being a nearly perfect teen romance that simply ended on a sour note, she contradicts this by stating that their relationship wasn't quite so rosy. As for Simon Lee, while the finer details are left up in the air as to what really happened and why Scott fought him, it's clear that he wasn't evil, or even that he kidnapped Kim. In fact, the two of them were dating each other until Scott intervened. It's likely that this hyper-idealized scenario was Scott's twisted way of coping with the reality that he actively stole Kim away from Simon Lee, which explains why she lays blame upon herself as well. It's guilt over leaving him in favor of Scott while her relationship with Simon was starting to fizzle out. While Kim does mention that Simon was a jerk in his own right, it hardly justifies being complicit and allowing him to get beat up on. If we are the main characters in the story we call our lives, then Scott, by virtue of being the protagonist, has deluded himself into believing he's the virtuous hero simply doing what's right. After all, there are few things more heroic than saving the ones you love from an evil villain. This is not unlike the video games Scott frequently plays, most notably the actively referenced Final Fantasy II/4, of which the parallels in that game's narrative carry a strong correlation. It can even be interpreted that the reason why Scott imagined that Kim was quote-unquote kidnapped was due to the fact that she and Simon were seeing each other, and he viewed their relationship as a form of captivity and sought to free her from it. Or even just the idea of them dating meant that Simon was actively stealing Kim away from him, the supposed hero of our tale, who is entitled to get the girl in the end. That is how these stories play out, don't they? I don't think I need to be the one to tell you how toxic and fucked up that line of thinking is. Ultimately, that's not reality. All Scott did was beat up some poor kid who, at worst, may have been a bit of a jerk by high school standards. And rather than reflect on the mistakes he made, he lied to himself in order to feel better about being a shitty person that assaulted someone for his own personal gain. On an unconscious level, Scott is aware of the things he's done, which is specifically why he represses his memories in this way, because instead of being honest with himself, he would rather sink further into the depths of his delusions and contort these situations into his favor, either regaling them as epic tales of heroism, or, in the case of Envy Adams, a way to garner sympathy. On top of all this, unlike what the flashback portrayed, he didn't even have the decency to tell Kim to her face that he was moving to Toronto. She had found out through their mutual friend Lisa instead. Cowardly behavior unbecoming of the hero, wouldn't you say? To put it lightly, Scott is a fucking asshole. So that's a lot to unpack. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, undoubtedly with a palpable air of suspicion, how this relates to me. What sort of nefarious shit have I been up to, you may be asking? I'm gonna level with you. This is gonna be rough, and that's because I need to get uncomfortably personal about myself. So strap yourselves in and prepare to learn more about me than you probably bargained for. Now, remember how I said to put a bookmark on Envy Adams? It's time to turn to that page. Her character is properly introduced in Volume 3, where we find out that she's not only an ex-girlfriend of Scott's, but is also currently dating one of Ramona's evil exes that needs to be defeated, Todd Ingram. Envy isn't just any old flame, however. Her influence is that of an integral figure in Scott's life and supposedly broke his heart in a traumatic fashion, of which the details are left up in the air. Adding salt to the wound was her leaving him specifically for Todd. Scott's relationship with Envy Adams is shockingly similar to a girl I once dated. Even the way she's drawn reminds me a bit of her, as crazy as that may sound. Just like Scott and Envy, this was someone I had dated for quite a while, but after a point she dumped me in favor of a guy I never met. Like Scott, this was a breakup that emotionally rocked me. She was someone that I thought I was in love with, only for them to no longer be a part of my life. It was so strange being with this person for so long, only for her to leave and with nothing to replace that emptiness. I was oscillating between depression, anger, resentment, disappointment. I began berating myself for all the mistakes I made, yet almost paradoxically blaming her and convincing myself that it was all her fault and that I was better off without her anyways. Clearly I was young, dumb, and didn't understand what I was feeling. You know, like every high school moron. She and I got into a few arguments after the breakup until I finally got over her and we never spoke again. Thankfully, unlike Scott, I never had to see her again and get into a base battle with her superpowered vegan boyfriend. But even besides that, the comparisons I drew between myself and what was happening on the page was not far off from the physical sensation of needles steadily digging into the pit of my chest until I fucking died from secondhand embarrassment, recalling all of these memories I thought dead and buried. There's even a flashback where he awkwardly admits he loves her, only to take it back. And haha, you guessed it, I also did something like this, except I didn't take it back. But just like with Envy, the relationship soured after that point. I try not to make assumptions or bring up authorial intent too much in my videos as a general rule of thumb, but if you'll forgive me a moment, I can't help but feel that Brian O'Malley had to have been drawing upon his own personal experience when writing this, because it just feels too real to have been a complete fabrication. Now then, do any of Scott's more specific transgressions relate back to me? Yes and no, let's get into it. Have I ever actively stolen some dude's girlfriend or beat them up over it? No, beating someone up is especially out of character for me. But, and I hate to admit to this, I did go out with a girl who used to date a friend of mine after they broke up. And while he never expressed being angry or disappointed with me over it, I realized that I should have spoken with him about it first. In a way, I went behind his back, which was wrong and not fair to him. To this day, we never resolved that, and since we grew apart, we more than likely never will. Unlike fiction, reality tends to have more loose ends than resolutions. On a related note, did I ever move away and neglect to tell the girl I was dating? No, but similarly, I have broken up with girls in ways that I'm not especially proud of. If you can believe it, I even fed a girl that bullshit line, "It's not you, it's me," when it was clearly her, and I wasn't honest enough to just say it. Finally, Did I ever make stuff up about what happened in previous relationships in order to paint myself in a better light? There's no easy way to say this, but yeah, I did. More often than not, instead of trying to understand the person I was with, to see things from their perspective, and to try and get a better idea of where they were coming from, I constantly rationalized my decisions as if I had done nothing wrong and painted the other person as just another evil ex that either broke my heart or had that breakup coming to them. In this way, I truly was no different from Scott. I was a fucking asshole. Now, I've referred to both myself and Scott as assholes multiple times now, but I wanted to bring up a different point of view brought up by the creator on this subject. In an interview, Brian O'Malley clarified that he doesn't think of Scott as an asshole per se, but rather as a fool. The distinction in this case is that Scott hurts those around him unintentionally due to being an airheaded moron that lacks self-awareness. This is an important part of his character that's easy to miss, and is something I have to remember about myself as well whenever I beat myself up over the past. Regardless of intention, I don't think most of what I did was because I tried to consciously hurt those closest to me. Rather, it was my lack of experience that led to me making poor decisions. This doesn't excuse the harm caused, but hopefully it contextualizes these actions into something more understandable. You know, all of that was really quite heavy, so let's get back on track with what was going on in the story. Soon after Kim confronts Scott with the true nature of their high school relationship, he reacts in a peculiar way. Staring out blankly, he attempts to dismiss the conversation altogether and tells her to forget everything he said. Suddenly, Nega Scott appears, prompting the two to start duking it out. Unlike the film, which used Nega Scott for an admittedly hilarious last-minute gag. Contrastly, in the graphic novel, this character had been popping up at different points in the story in order to build up to this very moment. His first appearance is in Volume 4, instigated by Scott finding out that Ramona spent the night with her ex, Roxy Richter. And his second is in Volume 5, not long after Ramona inexplicably leaves him for months on end. Both of these appearances are specifically tied to how Scott feels about his relationship with Ramona, because Nega Scott embodies the mistakes he made and refuses to acknowledge. With that in mind, it's only fitting that this final confrontation occurs when Scott is face to face with the very thing Nega Scott embodies, his unwillingness to see himself for what he is. At first, Scott tries to attack his mirror self to no avail, but then something curious happens. They stop fighting. Nega Scott gazes down with a solemn look, and then the two merge, forcing Scott to regain his memories and come face to face with the full gravity of his actions. Circling back to Final Fantasy IV again for a moment, both Cecil and Scott deluded themselves into thinking they were doing the right thing for the sake of the one they love, but both also come face to face with their dark side, wherein violence is not the answer. Scott's first reaction is to retaliate against the side of himself he doesn't want to acknowledge, much like how most players' first instinct is to attack during the mirror battle in Final Fantasy IV. This is partly rooted in an innate urge to reject the aspects of ourselves we actively dislike. In both instances, however, acceptance is the key. In order to move forward, we must come to terms with who we are, especially the aspects of ourselves that we hate. I've made decisions that I look back upon in shame and disgust. Times when I was cowardly, deceitful, or dishonest. And it is that part of myself that I despise the most, because I want to believe that I'll do the right thing when it matters most. But the truth is, that's not always the case. This was the moment that really sunk in for me and elevated this comic book into something so much more. As buried as those memories had become for me, I will never truly forget them. And that's okay, because they helped shape the person I am today. And I shouldn't pretend they never happened just because they paint me in a bad light. It's specifically because I've reflected and learned from those mistakes that I've been able to become a better person. And while I will probably always slip up, it's okay, because those will be new mistakes that I can also learn from. I may not always be the person I strive to be, but that's no excuse to stop trying. I think this is the core message of Scott Pilgrim. All of us have screwed up, and we've even tried to cover up for our mistakes and pretend they didn't exist because it was more convenient that way. But by doing this, we refuse ourselves the opportunity to grow. Yeah, I've fucked up and hurt people, but who hasn't? That doesn't mean I or anyone else doesn't deserve happiness in the end. And that's why Scott and Ramona end up together when the story concludes. Because ultimately, we aren't defined by our mistakes, but rather how we choose to move on from them. This has been your humble analyst, Daniel, and I hope to see you all again next time.